human creativity is the single most important currency from here onwards.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to La Frontera, a podcast dedicated to exploring the dynamic startup and venture capital ecosystem in Latin America and the innovators behind it all. We're your hosts, Cyrus and Tom. If you enjoy this conversation, we invite you to subscribe to our newsletter where we announce new episodes and share additional insights and resources for founders and investors alike. We'd also like to invite you to share this podcast with your friends and to leave a review on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube to help more people discover the show. We love hearing from our audience. You can connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter by searching for La Frontera Podcast.
On today's episode, we sit down with Tomas Uribe, co-founder and CEO of Mavity. Mavity is an AI-powered platform helping go-to-market teams orchestrate creative assets fast, easily, and at scale. For Tomás, from growing up surrounded by music and art in Colombia to building a startup in New York City backed by Pharrell Williams and Morgan Stanley, his journey is truly anything but ordinary. He shares with us how his creative roots gave him an edge in tech, how authenticity fueled his fundraising success, and how he's using AI to supercharge creative work. If you're a founder, an immigrant entrepreneur, or just love a good underdog story, this one's definitely for you.
Hey, Tomas, great to have you here. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Excellent. Yeah, great to be here. Thank you for the invite. Great to have this conversation.
Yeah, so let's dive right in. Obviously, you have an incredibly interesting background. And so would love to start from the beginning with the decision that brought you from Colombia to the United States. And then from there, we'd love to go into like the whole visa process because I think there's a lot of value there.
Sure. So my mom always wanted to move to the US because my grandmother has lived here for basically all her life. So I think every time, like when I was growing up, she was always thinking about how she can move to the US. She had this particular like focus and interest in universities, like the whole research and kind of like academic opportunities that all the universities around here provide. And so year over year, she would always get like this idea of it would be great if we could move to New York, like to the US. And I think that was really in my mind. And it was always around, I don't know, the natural like process was like, all right, you're going to study here, perhaps in Colombia. If we don't move before, you're going to study in Colombia. And then once you get to a certain point in your professional career, then you might want to exit, go to another country and do your master's. For me, even though that was always kind of like in my mindset, because of my, let's say, professional background, as I studied music, I became more in love with New York specifically. I would always say I want to study something that just opens up my borders and then my just general curiosity, rather than focusing something specifically, which is something that traditionally people more often do, especially in the arts. But I always felt like in love with New York, like from the first time that I came as a tourist, and then I came a couple more times, and I always thought, man, like New York simply has this thing that relates a lot with my personality, with the way that I see things, with the creativity, with the multiculturality that New York breeds and lives. It also has that like rawness of city that you see kind of like multiple layers over time. And I just love that. And I think it has a lot with the connection that I have in Bogota, but in a more perhaps organized way. A lot of people complain here in New York about the traffic, the subway system. But for me, this is heaven, right? There's 400 plus metro stations in Bogota. We haven't even built the first one yet. So there's a lot of things that people might take for granted here, but I always saw New York as this thing that I had to come. And in fact, when I applied to a master's degree, I only applied to one university only here, which was Parsons School of Design. Because again, like for me, it was like either I go there and I study, but yes, I have to live in New York and live the rest of my career there.
There's something to be said about like your dedication to come to New York, because that's definitely required to go through the slog of the visa process that is the United States. Would love to talk a little bit more about kind of what that looked like. I know right now there are a lot of students that are exploring starting companies in the United States as they're coming up to their graduation day, or like other immigrants that are looking to start companies and come to the United States. But I feel like the visa process is always pretty daunting. So would love to hear kind of like your story as you went through that whole process after graduating, or I guess before you even graduated, since you needed to apply for a student visa, right?
Correct. And I think visas, not to say, and of course, kind of the disclaimer here is that I don't want to sound as I'm complaining. It's something that I bought into and just had to learn back and forth, all the different options that I had. But in the
Yeah.
process, I had the opportunity to meet with a lot of people, right? So yes, it is a very complex process. It is a very frowned upon theme or topic because there's so many loopholes. And as we were talking before, since it's so complex, there's a lot of things that happen throughout the process that, in my experience, a lot of people will say, or I've heard a lot of people say, hey, I didn't know that I could actually get that visa, or I didn't know that visa even existed, or I didn't know that because I'm from a specific country, the same visa that you will get versus me, it can be different. It has different caps. A lot of these different details, right? So I started to like really figure out. And again, my purpose was, yes, I did want to study here and I want to stay here in New York and work and continue to work. And that meant naturally that I had to figure out how to navigate that. At that particular moment, I wasn't thinking necessarily about how to build a company, but I was thinking about, is there an alternative around this? Let's say, long story short, and then we can dive into very specific details around this. The way that I came to the US, which is the more popular way that people come, is through an F1 student visa, right? There's another one, which is like J1, which is where sometimes people use as a researcher, or depending on the type of perhaps scholarship that they have on their home country, that might be a visa that they can get to, right? But that has several different implications. The F1 student visa, once you get approved for it, then you come to the States, you study for a specific period of time in the specific program that you're in. My program lasted 2 years, and thus I would be able to get what they call here OPT, which is optional practical training. For lack of a better word, is basically you get a job, right? And that's the main opportunity that a lot of people have in order to not just get the job, but figure out a way where that particular employer can sponsor the employee. Now, that has multiple different implications, right? The first one is that the most traditional work visa through an employer is the H-1B visa. And especially in today's day and age, because of the politics that are around this, H-1B visas have been traditionally the ones that are addressed or connected with big tech engineers, right? People that most of the time or traditionally came from either India, Chinese, and a lot of tech companies applied for these employees for the H-1B. Now, what's the problem there is that it's still a lottery. Traditionally, and I don't know if that has changed, but at least in the year where I got my H-1B, there's always this cap where there's only a specific number of H-1B visas available per year, which is usually about 65,000 visas. And for those who have master's degree, like in my case, there's an extra 20,000 like visas that can be allocated to applicants. So again, a lot of different things that go in there. But when I applied to the H-1B, it was primarily because to the employer that I was working with, which was a startup, it was owned by a couple of Germans, also international. And I told them like, hey, being super upfront, you guys don't know me. Like I was literally working there for only a month and a half. So I had nothing beyond my goodwill and transparency of saying, I want to continue working with you guys, but this is what's going to happen, right? If I don't get a visa to you guys, or if at least I don't apply, then there's a very high chance that I'm going to have to return. And then you guys are going to find yourselves again, finding another person that will fill in my shoes, right? So we're very fortunate because at that particular moment, at the same time, I was with my girlfriend today, wife. She's also Colombian, also with from international background. And she was also in the same process. I would say that we definitely worked our way forward, but we got lucky because I heard and I got involved with so many other groups of international people, not just from my university, but from others. And they were saying like, oh yeah, IBM sponsored my visa. And I was like saying in my mind, like, how are USCIS going to approve my visa? I'm coming from a 2-person startup in Brooklyn versus IBM, who are the top McKinsey's and everything that they applied to for, I don't know how many tens of or hundreds of visas, right? But no, it's still it's a lottery process. So it doesn't matter if you have 100 PhDs, you still get into the same allocation. So to give you some numbers there, I mentioned the 85,000 cap. In that particular year that I applied, there was about 240,000 applications. And it always has to be in April because that's when the cap reaches. So there's a couple of nuances around that. Again, I got the visa. I was very fortunate. So I started to work. I got the H-1B. And then like almost when I was going to get to the second or third year, that's where I started to say I wanted to build my own company. And I started to figure out what were the additional like options or routes to do that. Because of my background, I knew for a lot of people that they got their O1. The O1 is what they call the Extraordinary Ability Visa, which is a work visa. but it changes fundamentally because it depends on you and your own case rather than depending on the employer that will sponsor you. So you basically just have to say, hey, I have all these extraordinary abilities or talents. This is all my case. And of course, the case is very big. So you definitely, usually you work with a lawyer to do that as well, because you have to build a case around that. And then my particular ability was music technology, because I got an award back then for something and then had some press mentions because of my background there. So I can make a case for that. Again, traditionally, the O1s before, let's say 8 to 10 years ago, was almost exclusively to like athletes, musicians or artists or performers. And then here and there, like some scientists, right? People that were super specific on something. Today, more and more, there's even, entrepreneurs that say, hey, I have an extraordinary ability and here's my case. So it's become more open. And yeah, I applied for the O1. That was all, of course, out of pocket. And then I was also fortunate to get it. There's no cap in there. So you can just apply whenever you want. I got the O1. And then a few years after, and that's where I incorporated the company, by the way. But then a few years after that, I was going to get my second O1. And that was around the first Trump term. And then at the same time, we applied with my wife through her employer for the green card. So literally, like, it was also luck, because at that same time that we got our green card in the mail, literally a week after, I got like an intent to revoke my second O1 visa, which basically meant that I was not going to get a second chance for the O1, even though I had 3 years of additional experience, of more press, of investments, of everything. But again, the officer that took my case, perhaps, I don't know, was in a bad mood and said, hey, this guy doesn't apply for this. We also got super lucky. And of course, you can imagine all the implications around that. Like, we already bought an apartment here. We've been working a lot. My wife was applying in that, but we were thinking, like, what would happen if we have to now go back after all these years, after that we've actually built a network around our professional lives here. But yeah, I guess we got lucky.
Yeah, no, I think the thing that gets lost on a lot of folks that kind of grew up in the United States is just how anxiety inducing the whole visa process is. Because I've worked with a lot of folks previously that they were students, for example, from India, for example, that studied computer engineering here in the United States, got their master's, and then went to work for a tech company. And a lot of folks, as they come up to the end of their visas, it's pretty stressful because you have an apartment here, you have a whole life here, you have all your friends here, you have a job. And if you're going to go back, you then have to uproot everything from here, go back to your home country and restart over again, especially if you can't work remotely for the current job that you're at. Yeah, I feel like that's something that's not talked about enough.
Yeah. And something that you brought up is just the due diligence that you have to do is incredible, because there's so many different programs that people aren't automatically like aware of. And so like for me and my MBA program, for instance, like most students, they come here and they think their only option is to work at one of these big tech companies, big consulting firms that, like you said, already have a certain number of slots where they can sponsor you. And I have personally like a friend who wanted to start a company here, and now he's about to graduate school and he has 3 months plus running at the end of his student visa. And he basically decided not to pursue starting the company just because he wasn't sure if he was going to be able to get the visa that allowed him to stay, and decided to go towards like a bigger company. So I don't know if you have any sort of like advice for people who are thinking of taking the entrepreneurial route, because like obviously as like me living in the US, being from the US, obviously we want to encourage people to have the chance to start a company here. Cyrus and I have both started LLCs in the past, and there's nothing but positive things that come from it. But any advice that you'd have, because you were able to navigate the process, do your due diligence, and be able to stay here to start a company.
Yeah, and I think we haven't even touched like we're barely at the surface of all these things, right? So you mentioned, for example, folks that come from India. There's like other specific visas for different people from other countries. For example, the TN visa that applies primarily for Canadians and Mexicans. I think the first piece of advice is definitely connect with other people that come from your background. Like, do your diligence in connecting with other folks. There's a quick story around this. One of the things that I started to do when I was in the last portion of my master's was to figure out which other founders from my university also got different work visas following that entrepreneurial roadmap, right? So one stat around my university is that more than a third of the student population is international. So naturally, there's a lot of people that are trying to do that, right? That are trying to figure out like how to navigate the immigration system, either remain here, get a job, different alternatives, right? And again, there's multiple benefits. A lot of people might think, oh, they just want to get a job. Now, think about all the taxes that come into that. There's a lot of benefits around in general for this, right? While I was researching, I found that this other guy that graduated from Parsons, he actually was one of the co-founders, the CPO at Taylor Brands. Taylor Brands, they're from Israel. They raised I don't know how much money right now. I think they're already like a Series B or C company, so they've grown a ton, right? But they have a lot of scar tissues, particularly him. And then he got invited, created this program called Entrepreneurship, which was short for International Entrepreneurs, right? So that was the program that came, kind of de facto program for entrepreneurs that are also international students. And they just wanted to create a community within a university to connect with other people like themselves and figure out some resources, corporate attorneys, immigration attorneys here in New York and other places, and other founders that have gone through the process. So for him, for example, he went through the O1 visa, and that was like the first person that I heard him say he's an entrepreneur. He graduated from a state university and he built a company and he has this design background as well. And he got it, right? But he was saying a lot of different things that I'm sure that you and your friends have also heard of, which is you go into this little dark room, you come into Border Patrol, they put you in there, they start to like either ask you for things in your cell phone. There's a lot of like very messed up stories of people very close to me that, oh man, yeah, I can't believe that this is happening. But anyway, a lot of these things happen, right? So I think another piece of advice beyond connecting with a lot of people is also, once you get all that information, do your own deep research in terms of what really applies to you. For instance, you might connect with other people like myself, right? But again, because if you're from a particular country, then you might have additional options to go through, right? There might be additional sources of capital. Even, for example, today, there's a lot of accelerators that actually say, if you're international, we can help you with X, Y, and Z. Back then, there wasn't that much of it, right? Because again, people don't know how to navigate the process of like immigration, right? They think it's just like another nuance of, hey, we don't have the money, we don't sponsor visas, period. But again, it's just another process, right? You just have to learn from it. So the more informed you are as a person, as an individual, the more that you can come to the table and lay it out. Like literally the same way that you're pitching to investors, right? You want to make sure that people like investors, they're always looking for a reason to say no. The same thing applies for employers who don't want to sponsor visas, right? They're always looking for a reason to say no. So the more informed you are, the more like data driven you are, you just say, hey, this is what needs to happen. This is the other alternative. This is how I can help. This is how you can help me. And these are going to be the benefits down the line, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Obviously, it's a lot more burdensome on an employer to hire someone from and sponsor them from another country, especially if they're an employer, maybe a smaller company that hasn't done that in the past. So if like you're able to bring that, like you said, like to the table, you're like, I've already figured out this process. I can help walk you guys through it, and also pitch why you're irreplaceable, like why they need to hire you versus someone else who's maybe just like easier to hire. Yeah. That's a great point.
Before we dive or go any further, I do want to back up a little bit and touch on your extraordinary ability in music tech that kind of first brought you here. So let's start there. Would love to learn a little bit more about your background in music tech and how that eventually led you to start your first company.
My background as a musician started when I was about 7 years old. Both my parents are extremely artistic. So quick context, my dad has always painted. If you go to their house in Miami, like all the walls are covered with paintings that they've done, both of them that they've done over time. I have paintings from them. Like I have a little painting here from my mom. Like they've done paintings all their life. That's one. My dad also has, naturally as an engineer, he's a chemical engineer. He always builds a lot of things. So one of them was like ships, like model ships. So I have one ship here, and he would just build them from scratch. Not like the model kits that you can buy today. You just literally go out and find and source the wood and build those things, right? Very artistic, and he played the guitar. My mom loved music, also painting, but also played the accordion, classical music and accordion. So as music and artistic as they're also engineers, but of course from a very young age, my mom put both my sisters and myself in music. My sisters didn't like really get that much of it, but I think there's a specific difference there, which I'm going to get into. But I got into an academy, a music academy. And in that music academy, I didn't only learn about music in general, but it was also like I don't know, this may sound a little bit corny, but it's like a high school musical. Like literally all these kids from different schools from Bogota would just come into this academy, just do music, have fun. And I think it was also an opportunity for us just to engage around another thing, right? Also because all my life I studied at an all boys school. So of course, when we were like interacting with other girls at music and around music, it was like a good opportunity just to connect with girls, right? So that was also part fun of it. So all the entire while I was in sports and everything, I would always go into the music academy. I started to get into a lot of instruments. And then because of that like connection with engineering, when I graduated from high school, I wasn't very sure if I was going to study music or not. So I went into industrial engineering. Again, both my parents are engineers. One of my sisters is a doctor. The other sister is also an industrial engineer. So I went into that. But after the first the first period of time, I was just like, no, I feel and breathe music in musical terms all the time. So I was just like, I just need to do music. So I got into composition. And then from there, I started to do multiple different projects, right? That's when I started to just really embrace the idea of building, quote unquote, like composing, but also just doing business, right? So at a very early like age, kind of from university, I would just set up my own studio and then sell music for advertising like agencies or something like for James, right? Selling, for example, music sessions. And so I think artists, by definition, we're the de facto entrepreneurs because you're always selling yourself, you're always putting yourself out there and building something, showing it to the world, and then continually iterate, right? So I think it's something that I got into just the habit of just selling all the time. It's a very hustle driven environment, as you guys know as well. Like artists have to hustle a lot. And it's always also about networking, about connections. So that's primarily like my background.
I think a lot of that kind of factors into you eventually co-founding Stereotech. So would love to learn a little bit more about that.
So I did a couple of things back then, which were perhaps unorthodox for musicians. The first one was that our band, we incorporated as a company. We didn't just have the band and just do music. We incorporated as a company. And that was primarily driven by myself and by the guitarist who also had a major in economics, in finance. So we were always thinking about like, how can we organize this as a business? Literally get some money from investors, invest in doing our albums, and then we go out and tour, we pay them back, all these ideas, right? So we did establish it as a company. That was one thing. At the same time, I started another business, which was manufacturing pedal boards and flight cases for the live entertainment industry. So I started building my own pedal board for myself. And then I started to get to concerts. I was performing live and everything. And other musician friends started to see my pedal board and asked, hey, where did you get that? And I told them I built it. And then because of that, I said, I can build it for you. So very much as you would build any type of MVP, that was my MVP. I talked to customers and then customers told me, hey, I'm willing to pay for it. So I went back to my backyard in my house. I used like those wooden skills from my dad, all his tools and everything. And I started to build pedal boards for a ton of different, not just musicians, but as the business started to grow, I started to sell to music venue like owners for their audio equipment, touring musicians that would go out and tour and need like gigantic flight cases. I would customize every single like case for all the musicians. I would incorporate their pedals and analog like connections, like electric connections for those pedals. So it was a pretty cool business. It was very much lifestyle. We started to grow it a little bit more. And that was also while I was performing and doing all the music stuff, right? Then after that, and at the same time I was having my band, we started to get into more digital stuff. So I started to hack a little bit into MySpace, just learning about HTML and CSS, pure simple stuff just to customize a little bit more. At the same time, there was like this ESP, like email marketing provider called FanBridge. I don't know if it exists today or not, but it was basically the email service provider for fans, like for fan emailing that we just signed up to. And we started to build a database of our followers in that. So I also started to do more HTML and CSS for the customizing of the emails. And of course, in design. So I would do all design stuff for the band. I would do all the visuals for the live performing of my band as well. I would connect it, and I had different MIDI equipment that would just synchronize audio and sequences with the background of the visuals. So I love like tinkering with stuff. Like I would plug it in with the DMX 512 lighting equipment that we just take. So anyway, I started to tinker a lot with that. And that's why when I moved to New York, I was able to like resurface all of that as part of the case where I could say I'm specifically extraordinary in music technology. And then that coupled with a couple of press releases that we had with my band playing in big festivals, doing tours that I literally had to show that I was mentioned in some specific press articles. So that really helped me down the line to build that case for the O1 visa when I had to apply. So that's fundamentally the
That's incredible. You guys seem to be pretty professional for a band,
Yeah,
especially
no,
that early
yeah,
on.
we wanted to be.
Yeah.
Also
Yeah.
because we were like more indie, so we didn't have the entire infrastructure of an actual label. We
Yeah.
had to build it ourselves, but that was also intentional, right? It wasn't just out of necessity. It was also intentional, just having a lot of control around what we wanted to do and what we didn't want to do.
So you're obviously entrepreneurial from the beginning, everything from incorporating a band to starting a company and now starting Mavity, which we can get into a little bit more. But I want to talk about a little bit how your background as a composer, as a musician, as a creative has contributed to the way that you start and then ultimately run companies and leadership, product design, and all of that. I think there's a lot of people who think, oh, if you're going to start business, you should have a business focused background or specific. I guess you did have an engineering background, but I think what is not recognized is like how incredible it is to be a creative and actually be an ideas person. So I'd love to hear your perspective and experience.
Recently, Y Combinator just came out with their call for startups. I don't know if you know this, but basically Y Combinator, every semester that they're putting up a new application or call for applications, this is our call for startups. We're looking for these types of companies, A, B, C, D. And one of the call for startups is designers as founders. And they specifically say today, where there's so many tools that you can build very quickly, like taste, user experience, knowledge, background, process, design, everything that differentiates the opportunity of a company from all the rest. It's fundamentally like brand, right? Why does Airbnb today so successful? Of course, they build it over time, right? But as a technology, it's relatively simple, right? It's straightforward. You can actually clone it today with all these other tools. But how is it so strong? It's their brand and their design taste, right? And Brian Chesky, for instance, he is a designer. Connecting the dots with all the other folks and why, to your question, Tom, when I was building Stereotech, I've always been a major fan of Nine Inch Nails. Nine Inch Nails, industrial rock band. I actually did, what do you call it? A tribute band back in Colombia for Nine Inch Nails. And anyway, I was obsessed with them, but particularly with Trent Reznor. I still am, right? Like I've seen them, I don't know, like 3-4 times already in different festivals here in New York, everything, right? But while I was doing the whole thing about Stereotech and the company, back then he was chief creative officer at Beats right before he got acquired by Apple. He was also starting to become very recognized because of his music for film. Of course, he was very recognized for Nine Inch Nails and producer for Marilyn Manson, for a ton of different artists, but he was started to be recognized as a musician, as a composer for these stuff like Social Network, then Gone Girl, then 100 of others that he's done over time and has won Academy Awards for it, right? So while he was doing that, he was also chief creative officer at this amazing technology company. And he was doing all these other things. I was saying, like, man, he's just using his music and his way of being creative just to channel different ideas and solving problems. And that's literally what music is. You're solving a problem at every single measure, right? The way that music kind of gets to the final tone at the end of a song is you're solving a problem that is evolving over time and then solving it at the end. And that's literally what you're doing as a business person all the time. And yes, business, I would say definitely, like, I need business skills. In music, I never learned anything about doing a financial model in Excel. And I think I regret that. I don't know if today in music or in other arts degrees, they teach that or not, but I hope they do because it's important. It's like the basic of everything, like the basic thing of everything, right? So I wish I could learn more about that. But I'm super grateful that because of the other things around music and artistry, that's how we got to where we are. And again, I always connect the dots between, but it's just a matter of solving problems every single day. And I think that's shaped a lot the way that I am as an entrepreneur, right? I love starting things. I love going from 0 to 1. And I've been more disciplined than I was telling Cyrus about how disciplined you have to be as a creator in order to just really focus and be determined in terms of where you should put your energy and focus to execute something, right? And that connects with what I mentioned as well before, which is the worst thing that can happen to one idea is another idea, right? And as creatives, we're all the time thinking about new ideas, right? And the line for that is that you have this honeymoon phase of an amazing idea. You get super amped up of, oh my God, this is the best song ever. This is the best business idea ever. And then suddenly another thing comes in, another feature comes in. You read a LinkedIn post, you listen to another song, and then suddenly the idea comes down. So it's very challenging to stay on track and continue pushing forward that idea. And I think that's something that me being very, again, more creative than executioner, I'm really trying to balance it out, right? Because sometimes you don't want to do the QuickBooks thing every single day. You don't want to do the taxes thing, but you have to stay focused. And that's something that I continually also share with other creatives, right? Like they have so much power in their hands. And again, going back to the YC call for stars, there's a reason why that's so important today, because that's what's differentiate us from all the other things that might have happened that are going to continue to be automated. And that creativity, that human creativity, is the single most important currency from here onwards.
One thing you mentioned previously when we first caught up was the worst thing that can happen to one idea is another idea. So I thought that stuck.
And I think a great point about YC, I think the fact that you come from such a unique background as a creative, you bring a refreshing kind of unique perspective, right? And that's something I notice here with all these business school students. I think the people that come from less traditional backgrounds, they don't come from Big Four consulting, MBB consulting, where you are taught to, hey, no offense. However, you're taught to think in this sort of strategic way, less out of the box. And I find that like in class, at least, the most refreshing perspectives are brought by those people who are more like creative thinkers. And that is something that I've been thinking about a lot, is that ingenuity, that human creativity is the most single important currency, what you just said, especially now with AI, right? And everything, it seems like things are just being regurgitated. There's no like actual like unique like creative thoughts. So being able to hold on to that and that identity is so absolutely crucial. So I hope more people like you, more musicians and other creatives like continue to start companies or at least be involved in sort of the entrepreneurship ecosystem.
Creative industries, particularly I would argue music, has been the guinea pig for any big innovation around history. So if you like think about back how we were using analog formats for music, whether it's the cassette or vinyls, and then when we switched over to CD and digitized all the information all the way to MP3, it was music, right? And then everything else became digitized. Then we think about the paradigm shift of Napster, right? And how Napster, again, completely changed the entire spectrum of everything. And then that eventually evolved into what Spotify is today. And then everything, all the different streaming services, also music, right? But think about AI. AI, even though today, since the launch of ChatGPT became way more like consumer driven, AI in music was one of the things that were continually knocking on the door, because it was something that you can music chord recognition and machine learning around that. For example, my co-founder, Christian, he did his master's way back when in music chord pattern recognition. And it was around music as well. And that's how also AI started to come in that. So around music, there was a lot of things that have been happening around it. And they'll usually use us as guinea pigs for new technologies. But yeah, it's interesting.
The one thing that I've been really excited about AI, but maybe more specifically like automation, like throughout my career, has been the ability for it to free up time and take on the monotonous work. Yep. To then allow you to have more time to think and focus on like the creative aspects of like your job or life, etc. Like you mentioned before, like QuickBooks, Excel, stuff like that. None of that's exciting. No one wants to do bookkeeping day after day. My undergrad was in accounting and I hate it. Yeah, I think like that's where I feel like AI is going to really kind of play a part. And I'm really excited for kind of hopefully like a new era of like creatives coming out and pursuing their paths, but not having to worry about like all the other stuff, that the unsexy stuff that comes with it.
Yeah, I agree.
I want to touch on Stereotech and then the pivot to Mavity, right? Obviously, Stereotech was more focused on the music side of things. Would love to dive into kind of like that I guess like that point where you guys realized, okay, let's expand it beyond what we're doing right now at Stereotech. And there's this whole other world of just like managing creative projects that is like untouched. What was kind of like that thinking behind that? And how did you guys make that pivot, especially?
Yeah, so I guess I think it kind of matched of multiple things at the same time, right? One of them was that back then we were closely seeing, for example, another company that Spotify acquired called Sound Better. It was also, and I think it still goes to today. They got acquired by Spotify and then they spun out again. But Sound Better was like a marketplace for musicians. So you could actually go there, you could look for like a Grammy award-winning bass player and then find him, hire that person, and then connect with them. However, the recurrency of that is very low, right? So we started to think, we like this. We know that there's a lot of creatives that are looking for this, but what about the demand side, right? Like from a marketplace dynamic, it's going to be very challenging to get a lot of, recurrency around this. So that was one of the elements. And we were like toying with the idea, all right, how can we make this better, right? Now, or not even make this better, but how can we ensure that whatever's happening around the marketplace dynamic is actually recurrent? That was one thing. The other thing around that was the name, right? If we were thinking about, all right, if we're not going to focus around music anymore, then definitely stereo and whatever connotation that has cannot be there. So that was the second element. And we were all the way going back and forth around that. And then the third element that tied into that shift was that we got accepted into Techstars. A little bit before that, we got some investment, like angel money and some early investments from primarily Pharrell Williams through his Black Ambition Fund. It's like funds Black and Latino founders. But anyway, around that demo day, that was when somebody from Techstars saw me pitch. And then from there, she said, hey, you should connect with Techstars because we have this accelerator opening up. It's about future of work. And I think what you're doing is super cool. And then we went through the process all the way around Stereotech. But then when we got accepted, I asked my managing director, hey, there's two things that we want to do. We want to raise some money as well, like to help us like move forward as we are in program. And the second one, we're thinking about rebranding. And the guy said, you're thinking about rebranding, do it yesterday, right? Because there's never going to be an ideal time. You get attached to a name, whatever it is. So just do it now, rip the Band-Aid and just do it. And I said, all right, this is the time to do it. So we did like a little workshop. We used some creatives through Mavity. Again, back then, Stereotype, because we had a lot of supply side. So we started to build that. And we basically said, all right, we're going to shift to Mavity and we're going to open it up more. Now that we have the actual name, we're going to open it up more for other types of creatives, particularly design and things, right? And design and creative. We already had kind of like the precedent of whatever Fiverr or Upwork was doing. It's a talent marketplace. We already knew the things that we wanted to do different. And that's how it came to be. Literally, that's when we launched through Techstars. We completely pivoted. We shifted like the business model itself, the buyer personas, like everything, like communication, everything like from the ground up. So that was the moment.
Very cool story. Yeah, I think I was thinking about when you were talking about indie bands, the parallel between an indie band and a bootstrap startup. So I guess you guys doing everything on your own, right? Versus using like a label. So it looks like you guys opted to join the label, join Techstars to expand your startup.
Exactly.
But the idea is very cool. I would like to also dive into kind of like at that sort of early stage and thinking about rebranding, pivoting, and all these ideas of like where you could take this. Were there any kind of mistakes that you made or directions that you tried to go that didn't work out? This is something that comes up when we talk to founders, and some people who have become successful founders maybe are uncomfortable talking about these sort of mistakes, but they happen, right? I'm sure there's like a million different times where you think you should be doing something, make a mistake, have to start over again. So are there any like specific stories or examples you have in those sort of early days, even starting at Techstars, where you had to switch?
Yeah. I don't know if we're going to stay here forever because the number of mistakes and things, of course, in retrospect, you're thinking, all right, you did it. It was like a necessary evil to get to where we are. But yeah, of course, they're like pure, like raw bad mistakes, right? I think, let's see, I would say while I was in Techstars. So one of them was, it was still a hypothesis, but we were very focused on saying, hey, we're going to build this for agencies, right? Because agencies need like the supply side, they need to manage better and they're going to love it. Again, like crickets complete, like nobody cared for it. We actually built a lot of the things and we were trying to adapt it and package it in a way that we would be able to like communicate with agencies. Long story short, that didn't work. But while we were in program, we started to get a lot of feedback from my own like cohort founders, right? Like the other startups saying, I need this, I need my deck, I need my blah, 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 I need everything. I already used an agency, didn't work. I spent a lot of money. I already used a freelancer on Upwork, it didn't work. I need this. Like, how are you making it different? So we said, all right, we're going to do it where you say it's a marketplace. Of course, we're going to do some of the managing in the back end and then just use the same, I guess, idea, right? So that worked in terms of business. But then the other thing that I think is another mistake is that we started to focus a lot on the supply side experience, which was the creative experience. We spent a lot of time and resources building for them rather than the end customer, which was the founder system. We still delivered to them, but I think if we could have spent more time thinking about, and again, in respect, there's a ton of things that has changed now that we said perhaps that wouldn't even have been the best decision. But anyway, I think we overspent a lot of resources in that to something that today doesn't even exist. Painful, but yeah, it's not there anymore. I think the other things that we started to perhaps be more cognizant of, and I think I did those mistakes a little bit before, but I think today It's just a learning process about who you need to hire. And I know there's a lot of founders that speak about hiring and then firing faster, but I think I'm more of what do you need at that particular moment, right? And then just, yes, make the call when you believe that you don't need that individual anymore, or you feel that it's going to another place. It never gets easier, right? Sometimes I made bad calls in terms of who we've hired, but fortunately, the more that we progress and evolve over time, the quicker we are in terms of saying, all right, this person has to leave, right? So there's literally been like something that on paper, everything was perfect, really good, solid like interview process. And then one weekend and we automatically say, hey, this doesn't feel right. Let's cut it off, right? And then we've been able to make those decisions. But sometimes before, again, those decisions took longer. And it was just like this, I don't know, weird feeling inside. Literally, it's, I don't know, it's how you call it. It's a weird feeling because you're waking up with this type of anxiety of saying like, how am I supposed to talk to this person or ask what I need from this person? So yeah, I would say those three mistakes. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, there's definitely common things that I think everyone has to deal with when starting a company. I want to dig a little bit more into that when you're talking about trying to figure out exactly who the customer is that you're trying to target, especially with a marketplace where there's obviously two sides. How many iterations of sort of customer discovery, interviews, and everything did you really have to go through to identify who ultimately like you should be selling this product to?
There's also a mixed bag there because we did a lot of interviews for other types of creatives and agencies and stuff. But I think we always have this bias of, all right, it doesn't matter what they're saying, we're still going to build it for them. And I think that's where we were like happy years, right? The same thing happens today with investors. Like you meet them once and you say, oh my God, this person's going to invest in me. And of course, no. So, it's just like you have this unconscious like bias of really getting the data. But I think in that process, we started to get more involved with our end customer, which was, that particular moment, it was like the business, let's say the founder. We started to get more data points there that helped us like navigate better what we needed to build, at least from a deliverable standpoint, right? What were they expecting? And again, in that moment, we were thinking about, all right, if we need to deliver good for them, then we have to focus on supply. That was the assumption that we made. And I think we didn't do good on that. But I think that was also, again, that was part of the process, like learning what is it that we need. In the end, it's all about that final experience, that customer experience, how we delight them, and then reverse engineer to figure out what we need to build. I think because it was a marketplace, we were building for one, starting on the technology, and the other one, we were building on the service and then trying to match it up and figure out where those two things coincided. In the end, it didn't necessarily. And that's why from a marketplace model, we started shifting more to what it is today, which actually, unfortunately, it has worked, which is more like B2B SaaS, right? And we've learned a lot of the things in the back end. But for example, so today, there's not a specific like supply service or side experience for them. We're using simply like other automation tools, all connected to the platform through Mavity. But we've always been focused a lot now on what's the customer experience, like what's the end experience, the people that are paying us, and then the buyer personas around them. How can we improve their experience, right? And then around that, we just get all that feedback and information.
Thanks again for sharing your honest thoughts about mistakes made in the past. We know it's part of the founder journey. I know that we're making mistakes as we build left there as well. As much as I hate to admit that, but it is what it is. So yeah, I know you started talking about what Mavity looks like today. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of some of the features that you guys have finally built out that customers or like users love and how it works today?
Yeah. So Mavity today, what we do is that we simplify creative operations for go-to-market teams. Go-to-market teams, of course, depending on the type of business that you are, you're either going to be, or you might be the CEO all the way to being an SDR on a sales team, right? In the end, you're figuring out how to manage all these different creative assets, how to communicate them, how to ideate and collaborate with your team members to build them, and then how do you ship them through different execution tools. So Mavity basically sits on top of these different frameworks of how to generate creative briefs. So we try to really think about how can that be innovated. Creative briefs have been used for the past 80 years. Traditionally, it's always a PDF or a document. So how can we actually use and leverage AI to communicate better? Because that's always been the challenge, right? Like how do you communicate between non-creatives, non-designers with creatives and designers, right? And we as Mavity want to fill that communication gap with technology, right? I think one of the main features is that communication tools that really help go-to-market teams communicate what they need to do and for whom. The second one is how to manage the project. So there's hundreds, if not thousands, of project management tools out there. The ones that we are usually engaged with, right? All the Trello, Asana, Jira, Core, Excel, even Google Spreadsheets, ClickUp, Monday, everything, right? They all do fundamentally the same thing. However, there's nothing that specifically focuses on the context of a creative project. So the key difference that we made was basically how can we always provide as much context as possible for whatever project or task people are doing. So we connect the brand or the particular product that the clients are working on, and that provides a lot of information for that. So, for example, if you upload a new asset, then Mavity will recommend specific updates in terms of fixes, padding, alignment, tone, messaging, everything based on the context of the brand, right? And that might happen for one particular asset to another type of asset. And then the third one is integrations with execution tools, right? Things like how do you integrate with Figma, with Canva, with Webflow, with all the other even ChatGPT, right? Like by all means, clients don't even care if they ask me, "Hey, do a logo." They're not going to care if I did it on Microsoft Paint or if I did it in Illustrator or in Photoshop and ChatGPT, right? They just care about the logo, right? So those execution tools, which we know there's hundreds of them, the idea is how can we integrate them and then use the particular best tool that will help people execute better. And that's the core thesis around what Mavity is today and what we offer.
Talking about integrations, how did that look like? Because obviously there's hundreds and direct integrations are pretty tough. Did you guys end up building direct integrations to each of these tools, or is there some sort of middleware you guys end up using? What does that look like?
Yeah. So yes, there is middleware, for example, like Zapier, but we don't have it as open yet simply because the more and more that we talk to our ICP and buyer personas, again, non-creators and non-designers, they are the ones that are buying Mavity precisely because they're overwhelmed whenever there's a creative that sends them a Figma file. They open up a Figma file and they see hundreds of little buttons and things that they need to do. The client just wants to give feedback on the particular frame. For example, in those cases, we're trying to integrate with the ones that we know that are really unique. Figma, one of them in terms of CMS, for example, Webflow. And then we're trying to make very specific calls around how are we going to integrate with them, right? That also positions us as a good way for acquiring or getting more users down the line, right? Or even becoming a potential acquiring target, right? If Webflow sees a lot of people are using their tool because of Mavity, then of course it's going to be that provides a lot of value. So we're trying to pick it here and there and figure out like what really drives value for the end customer.
So talking about value, and this is going to touch on another topic that we definitely want to dive into with you, which is fundraising. But talking about value, I guess one of your VCs is also a client. Can you chat about that for a little bit?
Yeah. So yeah, a few of our VCs have been clients as well, which is good, of course. But yeah, like for example, we've been fortunate to have VCs that have backed us, not just from a business or product perspective, because again, that has evolved. And particularly because of the stage that we're at, I think they trusted us and our ability to build and execute, right? Which I think it's the more natural way of how VCs invest in early stage. I think today, of course, there's more nuances around that, but fundamentally, it's just like you're backing up a founder and their mission, right? So I think there's Techstars, for instance, at the beginning, when they invested in us through the accelerator, then we were able to not just sell to other Techstars founders, but it became a channel. And till today, it continues to be a sales channel for us where we're selling to more Techstars founders and directly to Techstars programs. And at the same time, through that, Techstars invested as a follow-on, which is something that they invest in less than 1% of the founders that go through their programs. So it was very competitive, but fortunately for us, it also helped us a lot. And again, till today, we still have a very good relationship with Techstars as a whole, with different Techstars managing directors. So it's really good. I think another one, which was one of our most important investors, is also Latitude Ventures. So I think Latitude Ventures, I think it was also cool because I always use the reference of how I got into their radar. And I share that a lot with founders because it was literally just like pitching. The same thing as I was performing live back in my musician days. It was always like, you never know who's going to be in the room. And I always share this big photo where I'm on the screen, where I'm pitching. I won one of the days. It was like a pitch competition for each vertical. I won my vertical. And then after that, Latitude invested in Mavity, right? But the coincidental thing is that in that stage where I was pitching, one of the judges was one person from Morgan Stanley. And a couple of years after, Morgan Stanley is our investor. And it was primarily because that person saw me on that stage and we kept in touch. And then she was the managing director at Morgan Stanley. And she said, "Hey, I think you should let's apply with Mavity, right? And Morgan Stanley just recently came our investors. So it's a cool like series of strings of things that have happened over time that again, I always share with founders like, hey, you never know who's going to be in the room, and literally how you're performing live, even if it's just for your parents or if it's for a 10,000 audience, you still have to do your best. You have to rehearse so much that it has to be almost like completely by memory, everything that you're saying and you're doing. So you never know who's going to be in the room. So I think those investors have been really super valuable, and also because of those serendipitous like moments and connections that have happened.
So talking about kind of like your fundraising process, right? I guess what would be some of the advice you would give to other former founder or other founders currently as they go out and start to prepare to raise? Obviously, you did pretty well. Like you've raised the money from angels for the first startup, and then as you pivoted, went through Techstars, raised from Morgan Stanley, Pharrell Williams, which is really cool to see as well as like Latitude and a couple others. So as you're going through the funding process, you obviously learned quite a bit about how to pitch and how to raise. What would be like some of the maybe top like 2 to 3 takeaways that you would give as advice to like other founders as they're going out and raising?
Let's say 2 or 3 advice. It's fun because I give usually a lot of workshops actually for other accelerators and incubators. And I always, the workshop is called Designing a Successful Fundraise. Of course, underlining designing, like how we use design for a successful fundraise. And even though there's a lot of tips, I always start with this video of a cat video, which is, I don't know, a lot. Like Americans love to use cat videos. So I started to adopt that into my presentations. But it was funny because it's like a cat that's like in one side of there's like a big gap, right? And it's like a roof and then another roof. And the cat is like trying to prepare to jump from one roof to the other. And in the meantime, it's like showing as if the cat is like doing a lot of different formulas, like measuring the distance, like the height, everything, formulas. And then suddenly it comes the moment where the cat jumps and then suddenly it hits the wall and falls through, right? And I always start my presentations with that because I'm sharing like that's literally as an entrepreneur. Like you have so many feedback, so much like advice. A ton of people are telling you like, do this, do that. This is what happened. You should do this. So I always tell them anything that you hear in my workshop, just take it like as the cat, right? Take it with a grain of salt. It's just another piece of information. In the end, it's your company. You're the person, like you're the captain, right? And just consider that. So for me, I think some of the things that I've been always like thinking, it might sound basic, but it's like hone in to what really makes you different. Also with taking advantage of really being, I don't know, like self-aware of when to use it and when not to use it. For instance, I'm a musician, right? I don't dress traditionally, perhaps, right? I don't feel comfortable when I'm like all suited up or something. It's not me. I tried it sometimes because I thought that was going to be a better or easier way to fit into different molds. And then when I realized that I was not simply, it's like not me, it's unauthentic. I always started to figure out like when is the right, there's a thin line where I cannot overdo that, right? I have to be self-aware of the environment that I'm in and not just go out there and all tattoos and stuff. And there's people that simply don't connect with that. And then they're going to see that first rather than the content of what I'm sharing. So I would say that as a founder, be very self-aware. Self-awareness, I think it's super important. And the more that you grow, I guess, the more that you mature, I guess, the more that you're thinking that I have to think about that. Like, when is the right time to make sure that everyone knows exactly who I am, how I think, versus I think there's like a barrier to entry here. And I just have to be self-aware of that. And not everyone might connect with that. And that applies to everything for fundraising specifically. But I think that applies also to how you manage your team, how you communicate. Every single team member receives different way communication or whatever you're sharing, right? So it's very important to be self-aware. I think that's one big one, simple, but it's very important. The other one, I think more tactically, is just building like a good series of like tool sets or toolkits where they're going to help you like scale quicker, better in your fundraising process, right? So doing your research, knowing who to connect with. If you can do a warm intro, then figure out a system where it feels as if you were cold outreach is actually like thoughtful and meaningful for that other person. So yeah, so there's a couple of tools that I always share. I've been using Visible, for example, for fundraising and managing investor updates. There's a couple of different things as well that I think I've used over time. And of course, good design. I think, again, going back to the idea of creativity, a lot of VCs repeat a lot of what other VCs say. And if some VC says, an important VC, if they say, I don't care about design, then there's 120 or so thousand other VCs that are going to say, I don't care about design either. But that's BS. We consume everything through the eyes. And if there's something that fundamentally it's attractive and interesting, like I'm gonna continue to see it, right? I'm not saying that you have to over decorate every single thing or do animations. No, be concise, be specific, but also take care of those details. Like the devil is in the details, and people will notice when you spend some time understanding and making sure that your story and everything that you built and all those sweat, blood, and tears that you put into this will be correctly represented. And that's where I see sometimes founders that have typos, grammatical errors. I'm like saying, oh, sorry, but this isn't worth seeing. Like you have a typo here. No, it's not worth it. Like you didn't pay attention. That's as basic as we can get, right? But then there's other cool things. So yeah, I think pay attention.
No, that's great. I think when you mentioned like being self-aware, it's being self-aware, being your authentic self as well. Because at the end of the day, especially at the pre-seed and seed stage, like founder or you're really investing in who the person is and like what they know. And VCs can really cut through the BS. So don't try to be anything that you're not. And I think the other thing that you also mentioned that I think was important is it's design. And I think what you can really take from that is going to be storytelling, right? Because fundraising is all about telling a story and getting folks to really understand it and click with your story. They need to identify with your story. And I think that's where I recently did a poll on LinkedIn about memos versus decks, because I think a few folks recently started sending me memos, which they're fine. Like a one pager, I'll still read through it. But I think like a really well-designed deck that tells a story from end to end of what the problem is, like who you are, why you're fit to solve the problem, who the rest of your team is, what you guys are doing. I think that's where you can really tell the story versus a simple one-page memo that, especially if you don't tell the story well, it's just facts. But then what does the investor do with that? And you got to think that like many investors some of them have specific knowledge in probably what you're building, but there are many generalist investors that might not have specific knowledge in that space. So you need to help them understand why this is important.
Yeah.
Correct. So
if something came to mind, I want to hear your perspective on this as a founder that comes from another country and intentionally wanted to come here to study and then live and start a company. Do you think the US is still that place where people will come like for the future to start a company? Do you think it still has that pull for international founders? Or do you think right now what's happening with the current administration, just life being more difficult for immigrants, and then also just the sort of isolationist, nationalistic policies that are happening in the US right now, do you think that is going to continue to be the case? Or do you see a trend where people might actually choose to go to another country to start something or stay in their home country?
Yeah, I would say short answer is yes. Like the US, I think will remain and will still be that ideal place to build and start a company. There's a lot of talk, especially today, where information is basically 24/7 available from multiple different hundreds of resources all the time. And of course, there's a lot of people that will say, no, now I'm going to, I don't know, Ireland for tax purposes, or Portugal, but it's just like it doesn't go that far, I would say. Like I have for example, federal income tax, right? When you consider about like the 30% that it's being taken from your tax, and you compare it to other European countries, which might argue is like the second best thing in terms of like first world like access. The Netherlands, they take about 50 something percent. Italy, like 68%, right? So it's ridiculous. What can you do with that? And yes, there are still companies that are being built there, and that's great. But that's why I would say, I think it goes back to more of the idea of the lifestyle that you want to have, right? Norway, my sister lives in Norway. They have very solid like job security. They have 12 months maternity leave, 16 weeks for paternal leave. And is here, and Cyrus, you're also down. For example, here in the States, that depends on the state. It's not mandatory. Like, for example, in New York, it's 67%, and that's it. So even in Colombia, maternity leave is mandatory, 100% paid for 18 weeks. So anyway, there's a lot of things, right? But if you're thinking about, like building a business, by far the US is still, it has multiple benefits, not just because of the starting out a business, not just because of the opportunities and different ways that the system allows for you to build and capitalize on it, but also because of the nature of the market itself, right? 340 million people for so many different countries, cultures, backgrounds. And I think it's still very competitive. And I think disregarding whatever politician might be at the helm, like that's still going to be something that drives every single individual, right? Yeah.
I also wanted to hear from your view as an immigrant here, like how you've gotten involved in the political system. I think this is something that was such a big topic over the past election where you saw a lot of immigrants, specifically Latino immigrants, voting for a certain political party or a certain candidate. And do you have any sort of view on like how you educated yourself about the political system, got involved, and cut through the BS to really get to the point where you're supporting the party, the candidate that is maybe in your best interest?
I think the voting system is completely messed up. And I think I've lost a lot of interest in terms of the whole narrative. I'm really interested in what the policies, right? I'm interested in the impacts or the implications of the policies. I'm interested in the economic aspects of it, in every single aspect of it, but the political system itself of how to elect, how to vouch or vote for somebody. Yeah, I'm completely separated from that. And that's already been, and not just in the States, also in Colombia. As a Colombian citizen, I can actually vote for a Colombian president. But again, for me, it simply doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that I'm here and yeah, just for the morality of it, just I'm gonna vote for somebody just because I like or connect with him or her. No, I don't care, and I don't care also if other people say your vote is super important and do it. If I'm not 100% like feeling that I should vote for somebody because I really think that everything around that individual and the team behind that individual supports something, no, I don't care. That's one thing. I think the other aspect of it, in terms of how I've become more involved, I think I've done it from a couple of areas. One of them, for example, has been through a nonprofit called Engine, based out of DC. And because of different connections around here and there, they invited me to do what they call a fly-in. And was literally, I flew down to DC, or they flew me in, so we could, along with other founders from different backgrounds, women founders, Black Latino founders, to just speak to different entities and House and Senate representatives to discuss different topics. For example, one of them was going into the SEC and trying to figure out why it's important to redefine the accredited investor definition. Because over time, the accredited investor definition has always been around like how much money you have. And there's a ton of people that have a lot of money that don't even have a clue that being an accredited investor exists and that can generate generational wealth, right? Traditionally, or more specifically, around communities of color, right? There's a ton of people, for example, Latino, like first or second generation immigrants that have a ton of money because they built it over time because of real estate investments and everything, but they don't even have a clue that idea of accredited investor exists because it's been usually excluded for that. So how can you broaden that up? Also because there's people that can invest little portions of money in more areas, but that diversifies and creates more of a community and learning system. That's one. The other thing that we talked about was with a house. I don't remember. I think it was like a House representative. I think it was on the Republican side of things. They were coming up with a couple of different, like a specific bill, also around accredited investors and a couple of different things connected with that. So that was an interesting conversation. Another one was with a representative from the USCIS, which is the immigration entity for visas. And naturally, we were talking about the entrepreneur visa or startup visa. This thing that has been ongoing for I don't know how many years, and it still hasn't gone through the Senate or as a bill, right? There's so many different things around that. I think those conversations are definitely worth having because it's the people on the ground that are actually, it's a very specific, meticulous problem that can, if it's solved or improved, it can apply to a ton of different people. So that's been some of the ways that I've become involved, and I want to become involved more down the line. Again, on the voting system, I think it's something that I've always been thinking about how to make it more efficient. Yeah, that's it.
So Tomás for governor, right?
Yeah, hopefully. You know what? Talking about musicians, Rubén Blades, that's a very famous Panama musician. He's one of the most incredible artists around salsa, right? Rubén Blades was not only a musician with all these salsa. The guy actually right now lives here in New York, but he was also actor for The Walking Dead for I don't know how many seasons. He's done a couple of movies here and there, but he was also Minister of Culture for Panama, right? And of course, there's a lot of things around this because the guy has been in the trenches, built traveling all over the world, seeing a lot of different things, how things could get done. And I think he went really well, right? And I think eventually he wanted to, I think he wanted to be a candidate for president, but in the end, it didn't happen. But yeah, you never know.
Yeah, I know. There's so many like varying paths that kind of lead into politics, which is great. It's great to see kind of like that diversity that leads into politics. So maybe I'll see you on like the congressional like ticket one day. I'm not based in New York. I'll have to switch over there.
And I wanted to ask you what sort of values, and you mentioned this actually from the beginning, like one of the reasons you wanted to go to the US was just your mom's background and interest in going to the US and everything. I want to ask you, are there any sort of like values that your family have and that they raise you that you think about as a founder, as a leader, that still influence you today?
The general theme around both my parents, my sisters, that we're very close, even though each of us live in different countries. We still remain close. We have a WhatsApp group, like typical Latin America WhatsApp group with all your aunts, grandmothers, anyone else. But I think it's always about, I think just like depending a lot of family, but also having some space, I think, because even though we're very close, we know how to, hey, he's doing his thing, she's doing her thing. Like we stay very close, but very not into each other things, because I think that's sometimes also when families have become a little bit more convoluted. I think family relationships, when they start to get into other folks. And I think that's also connecting to your question, Tom. It's also like how I try to lead with other folks, right? In Latin America, a more traditional way of being is that a lot of people pry, right? And I think a more American way of being, it's you stay in your lane and you necessarily don't get into other people's things. So having that balance is tough because a lot of my team members are from Latin America. And it's not so much that I don't want to share or something. It's something that I don't want to like over ask and get into things. And I think that keeps things very like strategic, but also builds a culture where everyone knows, hey, they have my back. If I ask for help, I'm going to get it. But if I don't overshare, that's fine too. So I think that's the general value. And I think today, now that I have a kid and another one's coming on the way as well, like I'm thinking always, I think, yeah, family is always there. But in the end, it's like your core family it's what the day in, day out. And that's what you have to really like nurture and grow.
One of the reasons I asked that question is because me coming from a background of very East Coast, like American kind of family, that we don't get into each other's business. We're not very emotional. Generally, I've just been more like independent, but having so many Latino friends, dating a girl from Venezuela and experiencing like how the family culture is from other countries, specifically like Latin America, it brings a lot of things out that I think I craved like growing up that are not present in my life. So I love how like influential kind of like families are in your lives, and they stay for a very long time in cultures like yours.
Completely. Yeah, I think that there are differences, right? Those cultural differences are there and always there. And I think it's cool, like in your experience, right? You're experiencing that through other people as well. It's awesome.
Stay tuned for part 2 as we dive into therapy with La Frontera.
I know.
Tomás, this has been a really cool conversation, which I mean, I feel like we expected once we first connected. We're diving into some of the more interesting parts of your life, but thanks again for joining us. Really appreciate it.
No, absolutely. Thank you guys for everything, for the questions, for the research. Yeah, it was very fun, and it's always a really good process, like to dig in and you yourself, as you're talking through things, you recognize different things that perhaps you haven't just thought about in a long time, but it is really cool. And I'm really looking forward to seeing like the final version of this.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of La Frontera. We hope you enjoyed the show. You can listen to more great conversations on our Spotify, as well as on your other favorite streaming platforms. You can find us online at lafronterapodcast.com, and make sure to subscribe to our newsletter for show notes and to stay in the loop for new content. Ciao for now.